What analogy or metaphor best describes the nature of God's covenant relationship with all of humanity? Welcome to Theology Sabbath School, a ministry of the School of Theology on the campus of Walla Walla University. I'm Carl Cosart, the Dean of the School of Theology and the host of Theology Sabbath School. Today we're continuing our study of God's promise of His everlasting covenant throughout the pages of Scripture. And our special guest to guide us in our study today is Dr. Jody Washburn. So Dr. Washburn, thank you for joining us here again at Theology Sabbath School. And we are continuing this idea of covenant that we mentioned last week when Dr. Matilda Fry was here. But as we get started today, let's look at covenant in more of a general sense. What are some of the foundational aspects about covenants that would help us as we deal with this topic early on?
That's a great question. There are so many different directions we could go with this, but I think two of the things that are really important to at least articulate and notice right up front. One is, in the ancient world, covenants would not have been unheard of. They might feel distant or something we have to look up, but for the ancient world, this would have been a known and, familiar thing. And so that can make it hard for us as readers of the text to go back and figure out what would have stood out to someone in the ancient world when they encountered these texts that we're looking at. And one study Bible that I've looked at recently pointed out that what would have stood out in many of these texts is that gods in the ancient world did not make covenants with humans. That would not have been an arena where the idea of covenant was familiar at all. And so I feel like that's a helpful starting place, that as we encounter these texts, to think about the fact that God initiating covenant relationship with humanity would have not been normal, right? That would have been something that stood out, caught people's attention, and caused all kinds of questions. What kind of relationship? In what instances? For what purpose? And then the other thing that I think is worth noticing, or at least acknowledging as an ongoing discussion, is the idea of whether we should talk about different covenants, which can be really easy to do, right? When we get to Jeremiah, for instance, and it says the new covenant, then we think, well, there must have been an old covenant, and were they different or are they the same? And the lesson does a really nice job of pointing out right here at the beginning that when we trace the idea of covenant relationship between God and man throughout the biblical narrative, what we see is different iterations of the same relationship. So it's not like there was a relationship formed and then they broke up, right? And it was gone and over and done, and then a while passed and then they got together again, right? And then it was a new relationship. It's more like from the opening pages of the Bible in Genesis all the way through to the end of Revelation, we're getting an ongoing unfolding of this relationship between God and man. And yes, we can speak of different covenants, because there were particular ceremonies, there were renewal ceremonies, there were ceremonies establishing, these special relationships between God and certain key figures in the storyline. But it's important, I think, to think this sets God apart, one who makes covenants with people, and we are looking at a covenant relationship with a lot of similarities.
Okay, with that introduction, can you just give us an overview then of the different covenants we see in the Bible? You mentioned the fact that there's only one covenant, but there's a series of them that are mentioned by name. Can you tell us anything about those covenants?
Yeah, this lesson does a great job of kind of giving us this bird's eye view, looking down at the biblical narrative from 30,000 feet, as we say, and getting that big picture. And generally, when people talk about the covenant relationship between God and humanity in the Bible, there are covenant narratives that explicitly use the word berit in Hebrew, which is the word for covenant, and those would be Noah, Abraham, the covenant at Sinai with Moses is negotiating that, and then of course the new covenant promise in Jeremiah. And many scholars also help us to zoom out even more and to think about this even when the term is not explicitly there. So if we do that, it really starts in the beginning of Genesis, where you have this painting of this picture, this partnership between humanity and God inviting humans to co-rule with him, to co-create, to help make the world, so to speak. And that relationship then is brought back to the forefront of the storyline at these particular points along the way. And that's, for instance, with Noah. Many people think of, if those who describe the beginning pages of Genesis as the creation covenant, quote unquote, often talk about Noah as the covenant of recreation, like the world is remade. And then we come to Abraham, where Abraham is told, your descendants will be a blessing. Basically, all nations of the world will be blessed through the line that comes from you. And then we come later into the deliverance from Egypt. And the first time that the word covenant is used in those narratives is right at the end of Exodus chapter 2, where we see this God who sees the oppression of the people, who hears their cries. And that is the God who says, because I remember my covenant, right? Because of my covenant with Abraham, I am responding to those cries. And so there at Sinai, and then in Deuteronomy, you find the word Horeb, but the Deuteronomy narrative is a reimagining again of that Sinai covenant, this long speech renewing that covenant with the people. And in that case, it's not presented as being unconditional, like as in with Noah, right? It's not an unconditional promise. It's not per se described as eternal. It's very relational, like a pact, a mutual partnership described between God and the people. And one interesting thing for us as Seventh-day Adventists is that in this conversation about the Sinai covenant, for instance, in Exodus 31, you have this beautiful description where the people are going to be keeping the Sabbath, for instance, practicing the Sabbath throughout their generations, it says, and it describes this practice as a perpetual covenant. And then we come to another example with David, King David. If you read the prophetic texts, and especially, Carl, you're a New Testament person, and in the New Testament, Jesus is portrayed as fulfilling all of these, right? As connected to Adam, as connected. He's the new David. And this promise to David is spelled out in 2 Samuel 7, but there the word covenant is not explicitly used. But later on, we find that word covenant connected with this promise that this line, this house in Hebrew, the dynasty of David, would stretch on, and that God would carry out this promise from Abraham, right? All peoples of the world will be blessed through this line. And when we get to the new covenant in Jeremiah 31, I love how Tremper Longman talks about this new covenant, and he uses this series of more. He says this new covenant described in Jeremiah 31 is more intense, more intimate, more internal, and more immediate than the previous covenant narratives. And that's just beautiful. And this covenant is again, it's moving not only toward this mutuality of relationship, this dialogue, but I want to at least point out Isaiah chapter 56, and in that picture you have this reference to the covenant. The word covenant is used, and it's used in a text about foreigners. So not only people that are being drawn, back to Judah and Israel, right, that have their line traced to David or to Abraham. Says foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it, and who hold fast to my covenant. These I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. So there's this beautiful sense of expansion. And it ties back over and over to the promise that we see there in Genesis 12, even though the Abraham covenant is also described in Genesis 15 and 17. And one last thing I think is worth noticing, just in terms of the idea of mutuality. That's an ongoing discussion among biblical scholars who try to understand what exactly is the essence of this covenant. And there's a quote that I ran across in a beautiful book by Nahum Ward Lev called The Liberating Path of the Hebrew Prophets. And he talks about covenant as what begins the relationship. So he says, covenant establishes a relationship. Love provides the intimate quality of the relationship. And dialogue is how the intimate relationship evolves, grows, develops from day to day. So as we go through and see these different iterations, these renewals, these reimaginings of the covenant relationship between God and humans, we're witnessing this unfolding, this relationship that is being discovered and almost created again over and over as God initiates over and over this relationship with people as their circumstances change.
I think that takes us back to this kind of theme we said, that really a covenant establishes a relationship. And I know for me, one of the things that really helped me when I first learned about covenants in the ancient Near East was, you've already mentioned this word berit. And what caught my attention with that is that word means to cut. So you're actually cutting a covenant. And to me, this is always fascinating. You see it every day as an Old Testament scholar, but to me, it's always fascinating to go to the Old Testament, and the description, the words they use are so descriptive. They're visual, and it has in mind this idea of taking an animal and slaughtering this animal and making a formal agreement that would bind two parties together. And so this idea that God would use this kind of language, we'll talk about that a little later, I think, in our study, but that this very visual idea of a formalized relationship, and one that really matters, and signified by a sacrifice. But you mentioned, what was interesting to me was the passage in Isaiah that talked about this covenant even including foreigners. I guess the question that comes to my mind is the memory verse passage we had for this week's lesson is taken from the book of Exodus, and I'll just read it here. It's Exodus 19, verse 5, where God says to the children who are gathered there at Mount Sinai, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you," and it seems the you here is the children of Israel, "you will be a peculiar nation, or a treasured possession to me, more than all people, for the whole earth is mine." So what do we make of this idea that the covenant at Mount Sinai seems very much centered on the nation of Israel, yet the passage in Isaiah has a much more universal scope? Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I want to say a word. I'm going to go and just say one word about your comments about the Hebrew of the cutting, because there's an element there that I think is really worthwhile to point out, and that is that when you cut a covenant, when you karat berit, right, in Hebrew, it's just describing this essence, and it's not just a ratifying or a making binding of an agreement. It's more like a self-curse. So essentially, if we go to the Abraham narrative, where you have the fire passing between these cut pieces of meat, it's not that the ceremony said, "Oh, see, this is the real deal." It's that there was a practice of calling down a curse on yourself. So, for instance, something like, if I don't keep my side of this, agreement, then may I be cut in two like this animal was cut in two. So it's a conditional self-curse. Oh, it's an oath. It's an oath. We don't swear oaths that way by calling down self-curses upon ourselves, right? We sign. I just had to go to the notary for something to do with the bank, right? And you sign and you have someone watch you sign, and then that is the hard and fast sort of agreement. And so we don't have even a framework for understanding that idea of self-curse, of conditional self-curse as oath. And I think that can be really helpful because some of the language can feel really strong. We read these curses connected to the covenant and we think, ooh, yikes. Like, you don't want to get on the bad side of this God. And I think some of that sort of, we might kind of shrink away or have a question mark pop up. And some of that comes just from our lack of familiarity with some of these practices.
What comes to my mind when you say that is that just gives me another image of your earlier comment where you said that the ancient gods don't make covenants with people, because then, based on what you just said, that would mean that the ancient gods would have to invoke a curse upon themselves. And what God would invoke a curse upon himself? Wait, hold on, I know a God who would do that, right? It's the God that took our curse upon him, the God of the Old Testament, the New Testament. So to me, I think we could probably spend the rest of our time talking about that, because to me that's just really amazing.
Yeah, when we say incarnation, we don't mean a God who decided to be king on earth, right? We mean the God who showed up there in Genesis with Abraham, and God is the one who passed between, implying exactly what you just said, that God, because of his deep desire for this mutual dialogical relationship with humans, entered into that self-curse, right? Called down that self-curse symbolically upon himself because of how much he desired that relationship. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. But going back to your other question, I think besides some of the strong curse language that we read in these covenant texts, and then of course that picks up the prophets are interpreting everything through covenant, and it goes on and on. But the other part of this that can be really, really hard is the sense of why God would it seems so arbitrary, I guess. Why would God just choose this one group? Why this one family? Why this one line? And I think that comes up in this memory verse that we have for this week, in that line, the peculiar possession, the treasure, the special treasure. There's different ways. Some translators just say like his own, right? His own possession. So it's really God's more than any of the other people groups. And that word can just mean property. I mean, it can be used in a generic sense, like just a possession, but it is used multiple times. And I think it's worth reading maybe a couple of these. So I'm going to turn to Deuteronomy, but while I'm turning there, let me just read the one from Malachi. Malachi chapter 3 has this line, and it talks about, so on the day when I act. So it's like one of those, that day, this judgment that's good news for God's people, this judgment that is going to bring about the fulfilling of these covenants in an even more embodied and real way. On that day when I act, it says, they will be my treasured possession. I will spare them just as a father has compassion and spares his son. And so there is the mixing of this covenant metaphor with this idea of a parent-child relationship, and that use of that phrase, treasured possession. And then in Deuteronomy, you see this phrase multiple times. It's almost a formula. So it comes up multiple times. But I want to look particularly at the example in chapter 26. And in Deuteronomy 26, I'm looking specifically at verse 18. We read, the Lord has declared you are his people. So there you have this sense of belonging. And then it goes on. His treasured possession as he promised. So it's connected right back to this ongoing promise, right? This mutual pledging to each other between God and the people, as he promised, and that you are to keep all of his commands. And I want to read a little farther. It says in verse 19, he has declared that he will set you in praise, fame, and honor, high above all the nations he has made, and that you will be a people holy to the Lord your God, as he promised. So that as he promised comes again. And this can be really hard. It can feel arbitrary, like I think many times the way my students experience it is that they say, well, God looked down and he chose this one group of people to bless them. So isn't that like a little awful? Kind of like having a quote unquote favorite child, you know? Like if you have a favorite child and you pour 3 times as many resources into that child's schooling or the nutrition in their lunchbox or whatever, right? We perceive that as really arbitrary. Why would you do that? Why not? Then you're not blessing the other children. And something that, one quote that I ran across recently that helped me think about this was by Amy Peterson. She wrote a book exploring virtues, and she called it Where Goodness Still Grows. And she talked about this, and she says, Israel is God's particular love, God's chosen nation. But there is nothing in God's love for Israel that hurts or oppresses those outside of Israel. Quite the opposite. Israel is blessed by God in order to be a blessing to the nations. There we have, right? Again, going back to Abraham in Genesis 12, to be a blessing for all peoples. She goes on, through Israel, God's chesed, the inheritance of loving kindness that God has for God's children, becomes available to anyone who wants to receive it. God's vision is for a wildly inclusive family where any outsider becomes a son or daughter simply by choosing to accept his offer. And I love that. Like, being a particular nation doesn't mean that somehow the others are cursed in comparison to the blessings. It's simply they become a conduit of that blessing that flows out. And I think that's the picture we get in the prophetic texts, particularly the post-exilic texts, and then of course picked up in the New Testament where the gospel goes to all nations.
That's a great quotation. I like that one. You know, it is interesting because when you read that, you can kind of resonate with a turn of a phrase, how it's expressed. And that kind of takes me back to our opening question, which is, you know, what analogy or metaphor best describes God's covenant relationship with his people or with all humanity? And I guess it's interesting because I get real excited to learn about the ancient covenant being a berit and it's cut and there's covenant curses. Like, that kind of is exciting to understand that. But really, that terminology was used because it was most effective. It was common terminology. It was a metaphor that God used, you know, some 4,000 years ago to describe his relationship with his people. So I guess my question would be, what would be the metaphors or analogies then today that might better communicate, or at least communicate in our own terms, the nature of that relationship that God wants to have with all of humanity?
Yeah, that's a personal question. You know, the more I think about it, I still remember the first time I ever interacted with a person who, the Lord's Prayer. This is so common, right? Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And the first time that I engaged with a person who talked about how, because of the really harmful relationship with their father, that just was not helpful to them at all, right? They had to find a different way to frame that. And for many, many people, that prayer is so helpful and so useful in this connection, with God. So going along those lines, I think it's a beautiful gift that we're given in the Hebrew Bible, that we have a multiplicity, like we have multiple analogies, metaphors. And probably, I'm trying to think, I'm kind of cynical when I talk to my students about covenant, and we say, well, is marriage a good analogy? Oh, yes, it is, for all these reasons. And then I say, well, I don't know. Then we also have the lines that go around saying, well, like, such and so just wasn't making me happy anymore, so I left, right? And I think, well, that's not a good analogy for marriage. And we also have adoption, right? Adoption is a beautiful analogy, and it's not a new, so the marriage analogy is not simply us taking a modern day thing and using it to illustrate. This is taken directly out of the biblical text. And the other analogy that works today is adoption. So, I have a classmate from college who adopted a child at birth and took them into their family, and they're you know what I mean? They're pledged to each other. And each of the analogies is limited in one way or another, and each can be really helpful in different ways. And what I find is that some people really need one over the other. The parenting analogy is really helpful. Others, it's not. It actually puts a wedge. Sometimes the marriage analogy is really helpful. So I think it's very personal, and I'm just grateful for these multiple analogies, metaphors that we find in Scripture for the divine-human relationship, because it gives us that freedom to explore, to figure out what parts of the metaphor or analogy are helpful to us and which parts maybe not, and to keep digging deeper. Whenever I sit with it's so fun. Whenever I sit with a group of students talking about the covenant in the prophets, and we talk about this, we always come up with new applications of the adoption or marriage metaphor and how it can illuminate this relationship.
And I think that's where we kind of go back to what we mentioned last week when God came searching, where are you? And to me, that's what we see throughout the Bible, is that God uses different genres of literature, different experiences, different terminology, all in an attempt to touch our hearts, to help us recognize who He is, to help us recognize who we are, right? Who He's called us to be, and the type of relationships that would bring true happiness to us and be a blessing to this world. I guess our time is just about up, but I have maybe a final question for you. And that is, we talked a little bit about, and we'll talk in more detail in future lessons about the covenant at Mount Sinai. But, we do have, God coming in and talk about all the things He wants to do for the people of Israel. They'll be His treasured possession. But it seems strong when there's an if right in that passage where it's like, if indeed you will obey my voice. And that almost sounds like, God loves us. He loves me when I'm good. He doesn't love me when I'm bad. How do we relate to this strong, and sometimes it's not that, I don't want to be misunderstood that obedience is bad, but it seems like God's blessing is predicated on the fact that I get the blessing if I obey. If I don't, sorry, I'm out. Can you help me understand that passage?
Yeah. Again, I'm gonna go back to Nahum Ward-Lev's book, because I think in the last 2 or 3 years, all the explanations of this that I found, his has been the most helpful. And he points out, for instance, that in different translations you find different choices for how you put that word Shema. It's Shema in Hebrew. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Shema. And this word, for instance, he says, many times it's powerful people who have the money to commission a translation of Scripture. So then they commission, let's take the King James Version, where this word Shema is often translated obey. And he points out how this is mirroring the idea of God as a king. And the idea of a king was like a distant, powerful, commanding figure who, wanted unquestioning obedience. And we're not always mindful of how the choice of words reflects our own assumptions and presuppositions. And I just love, I don't know if I have, I'm going to just read this. He says, listening is different than obedience. So he's making a case for the English word listen as a better translation in many cases of Shema. Listening is different than obedience. It relies on a more dialogical and intimate relationship, and it implies that the listener will hear a message, thoughtfully process its content, and then respond. So it's this mutuality, this sense of agency. And he has, much more depth that he adds to that explanation. But it kind of takes me back to the idea of how easy it is for us to think of a covenant as a contract, you know, going back to the bank, right, the notary, this sort of imagery. And contracts are there to protect us from each other. Like, I signed a contract last week with a notary watching because I'm trying to protect myself from someone else I'm going into an agreement with, right? And Gregory Boyd, I don't know, I love his description because he says, you know, you enter into, let's take marriage as an example. You enter into a covenant because you trust the other person, right? Not because you know everything about them, but because you trust them. You enter into this mutual pledging of trust, pledging yourself to them. And it's therefore, it's by nature like you're focused outside of yourself. Whereas a contract, and I think we often go to the Old Testament and we think covenant is a contract. He says contracts you enter into because you don't trust the other person. You enter into it because you're trying to protect yourself from them. And so this idea of partnership, of this mutual pact, of this God wanting to enter in with us, right? I think there's so much depth there that we can unpack if we can step back from maybe the immediate connotations that come into our mind with the covenant language.
You know, when you say that, it brings back all these memories from my maybe troubled childhood. When I would do something I wasn't supposed to do, my mom would say, like, "Didn't you hear me? Didn't you hear what I said?" Because that idea of action being connected to hearing. So I don't like those memories, but I like that concept of did you really hear? Do we hear God? You know, our time is up already. It goes so quickly, but maybe just one final question for you, an application question in the end. So what's the take-home message from this week's material? What can we apply? What should inspire us? What's the final word on this week's lesson?
Yeah, I love that question. I think for me personally, there are two things that I find really helpful. Going back to this idea of both in the Nahum Ward-Lev book and also Gregory Boyd, you know, the idea that a covenant is the beginning. Like, you enter into a covenant, you sign the marriage document, you don't know each other that well, like pretty much hardly at all, right? The idea is to have a whole entire life of story together unfolding after that. And that I find just beautiful, that trust does not require full knowledge. I think we get that mixed up so often. It doesn't. You can choose to pledge yourself to enter into this mutual trusting relationship, and God himself does that. He trusts us even though he can't necessarily control what we do with that trust, and he seems to be okay with that, and I find it just beautiful. And the other element of this that I just keep going back to over and over is, maybe this is my personality, I love to control things and plan and just make sure everything is going to turn out right in the end. And this is so common. So the Hebrew Bible is anti-divination, always talking about, you know, we don't do divination like those people over there. And Abraham Joshua Heschel points out that what's really at stake is, in the practice of divination, he has this little line where he sums it up. In the practice of divination, man is seeking God's answer to man's question. So man is whose humans are initiating and saying, you tell me this, and should I do this? In the biblical text, God initiates. Doesn't matter what humans do, God always reinitiates. God is the one who sees and hears and initiates relationship. And Heschel, you know, in his little comparison, he says, you know, the prophets, when they apply the covenant, they are serving to seek man's answer to God's questions, right? God is reaching out, and the prophets are that you know, body of people that seek man's response to God.
Yeah, that's powerful. Thank you, Dr. Washburn, for an excellent lesson today, and for you, our viewers, for tuning in once again. And we do hope that this week's lesson would encourage you and all of us to learn to trust in our God more fully, because what a wonderful God he is. We invite you back next week to join with us again, as Dr. Dave Thomas will be our lead teacher. We'll be continuing our study of the covenants, looking at a covenant for all the nations. So until then, take care, God bless, and we'll see you next time.